What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Templar healer. So healers in general across all the 6 different classes in the game have definitely seen a gameplay shift in how they're healing. It's mainly due to a couple of changes that have been made to some of their core abilities here, namely Illustrious Healing, Healing Springs, and Energy Orbs. Changes to those 2 abilities have basically shifted the gameplay around for healers. Now it's not really about spamming orbs or spamming springs anymore. Now it's basically trying to make the best use of your global cooldowns in order to best optimize for supporting your overall group, and specifically your DPS. With that in mind, we will still be going over pretty much everything to know to basically create this build. But at the end of the video, we're going to be kind of discussing the changes that have been made in Scalebreaker that you're going to have to kind of adapt to if you intend on healing endgame trials content. For dungeons, it's a little bit of a different beast there, but the advice that I hopefully will guide you towards being a better healer will also be applicable for 4-man dungeons as well. So we will be going over gear, skills, attributes, everything you need to know. We'll be discussing a lot about the skills and the gear because as a support role, you will need to have a lot of flexibility involved in both your gear and your skill choices there. And then at the end of the video, just because we're a healer, we don't really have a parse. Instead, I'll be talking about the philosophy of healing. And again, I will be kind of focusing in on the changes between Elsewhere and Scalebreaker in terms of gameplay, particularly in Trials sort of content, endgame PvE content. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here first with gear. So this is just one of many different possible setups. I will be discussing the various sets that you're going to want to have on hand, when you're going to use them, why you're going to want to use them, and so on. But just starting things off here first with our first sort of gear set here. Oops, it looks like I forgot to get something on there. There we go. So we have Symphony of Blades as our monster helmet set here. So this set here, we're missing the Max Magicka enchant, but that's okay. Symphony of Blades is one of the strongest support sets in the game, mainly because of the resources that it's able to return. So when you heal an ally who's under 50% of their primary resource, you restore Magicka or Stamina, whichever one is higher for them, for 6 seconds every 18 seconds. Now, you cannot activate this on yourself. You can only activate this on somebody else. But the additional resources that you get back is actually pretty strong overall, and it's definitely a set that you want to pick up here. This comes from Depths of Malatar, so you do need to have access to the Wrathstone DLC in order to get this set. There are a few other Monster Helm sets that are also pretty good options for you to pick up, particularly if you don't have access to the Wrathstone DLC. Just going down the line here really quickly. First one is going to be Rkugamz, which received a little bit of a buff in Scalebreaker, so now the spider will always spawn on wherever it happens to proc on. So whenever you heal yourself or an ally, you have a 10% chance to summon a spider that heals for 1303 health and restores 500 stamina to everybody within 5 meters for 8 seconds. So this is really useful for stamina heavy DPS groups with that additional stamina return. 500 stamina every second for 8 seconds is nothing to laugh at. If taking into consideration the 15-second cooldown, it ends up being a little bit over 250 stamina per second effective regen, assuming you proc it on cooldown. So that's actually a fairly decent amount of stamina regen, so really strong set if you're in a stamina heavy group. Moving on from there, Troll King is situationally useful, so when you heal somebody, if they're still below 50% health, their health regen is increased by 1548 for 10 seconds. This does not have a cooldown, so as long as they're under that 50% health after your first heal, they will continue to refresh that additional health regen. Now I say this is situationally useful because the health regen in general is not particularly strong in terms of healing. It ticks every 2 seconds, so if you want to convert this into direct heals done per second, it actually ends up being pretty weak. It's only about 750 healing done per second. However, there are certain fights in the game where the tank or DPS might be affected by a defiling debuff, so that basically reduces the amount of healing they receive. Some of these defile debuffs do not affect health regen, so in that instance, Troll King is actually pretty strong because of the additional health regen that it gets back. Moving on from there, Earthgore has pretty much been phased out of the healer meta. It's still not a bad set, but I wouldn't necessarily pick it up per se. I wouldn't necessarily spend time farming for it. This comes from Bloodroot Forge, so you do need to have access to that dungeon in order to grab this set here. It just is a very large burst heal for one person within the area every 35 seconds. The good thing about Earthgore is that it will always proc when you need it. It will never proc on somebody who has full health. It will always be on somebody who needs the healing done. However, the long cooldown, the fact that it only heals one person, kind of reduces its overall effectiveness in PvE. Moving on from there, you have Bogdan, which is still a pretty strong healer set to run, even though it was hit by a nerf in Scalebreaker. So the proc chance was increased to 10%, so this lasts for 6 seconds. The effect can only occur every 10 seconds now, and the amount of healing that you do has also been dropped a little bit to 3290 health every second. That being said, it's still a very powerful AoE heal Monster Helm set, so if you just want raw healing, Bogdan is definitely the Monster Helm set to go for. But moving on from there, there really aren't many other Monster Helm sets that you can pick up. There are a couple of ones that are very niche, so for example Lord Warden Dusk might be used in very niche scenarios, but generally speaking the Monster Helm sets that I covered are pretty much going to cover most 99% of the fights in the game. Moving on to our sets here, we have Olorime, Perfected Olorime as our first set. This is on the body, but you can also wear this as a backbar set if you want to use a unique restoration staff. This comes from Cloudrest, so you do need to have access to the Somerset expansion in order to grab this set here. This is the best way to get Major Courage. There's only two sources of Major Courage in the game, Olorime and Spell Power Cure, and Olorime is definitely superior to Spell Power Cure in a lot of different ways. So definitely a set you want to pick up if you intend on healing endgame content. That's not to say that Spell Power Cure will not get you through endgame content, but most guilds will be looking for Olorime on their healers and not Spell Power Cure. So unfortunately, if you do want to main a healer, you will have to find some way of getting Olorime, whether that's purchasing Somerset or finding a way, basically getting like ESO Plus, because now it comes with ESO Plus for a month, and farming Olorime that way. Your second set here is going to be Martial Knowledge. This is a old set that has been repurposed as a support set. So the new 5-piece, while your stamina is below 50%, your light attacks cause the enemy to take 8% additional damage for 5 seconds. That can occur once every 8 seconds. This basically works out to be an effective 5% additional damage taken if you were able to proc it on cooldown. So overall, a pretty strong set in terms of overall debuff. To give you an idea, 8% additional damage taken is what Minor Vulnerability gives, and this does stack with Minor Vulnerability. So in terms of damage taken debuffs, it's one of the rare few that is fairly consistent to apply. Now the proc condition is a little bit limiting, so while your stamina is below 50%, this does mean you will have to find some way to get your stamina below 50%. On a Templar healer, that usually comes from using Power of the Light. You could also dodge roll or block cast certain abilities in order to get your stamina down to that level. And at that point, the only real stamina ability that you would have to maintain would probably be Power of the Light. Things like Vigor and Circle of Protection might be on a stamina DPS, for example. Bone Shield is another potential way to get your stamina down, but you might not necessarily be using it very often. So getting that stamina proc chance at below 50% is actually not difficult to do as a Templar. It's mainly maintaining it that's going to be a little bit more difficult. It might require some micromanaging of your overall resources, but Martial Knowledge is definitely a set that you want to hold on to for its very powerful debuff effect now. Moving on from there, the first thing that we're going to be going over are going to be what's called the unique restoration staffs. I like to call them the arena staves, and those basically are the Massive Restoration Staff, the Maelstrom Restoration Staff, the Asylum's Restoration Staff, and the Blackrose Prison Restoration Staff. We're going through each of them in turn. So starting off first with the Asylum Staff. The Asylum Restoration Staff, the perfected version comes from beating Vet Asylum on +2, so that's all 2 of the side bosses plus St. Ohms. The non-perfect version comes from any other configuration of Asylum. The difference between them is basically 3%, so the perfect Asylum Staff, when you cast Blessing of Protection, the cost of your Magicka and Stamina healing abilities are reduced by 30% for 3 seconds. The non-perfect version reduces it by 27%, so not that big of a difference overall. Really decent for sustain. However, with the changes that have been made with energy orbs and illustrious healing, you don't really need the additional sustain from Asylum anymore, and there are actually stronger sets to use instead of the Asylum now. Moving on from the Asylum staff, you have the Blackrose Prison staff, which is situationally useful. So the perfected version comes from just finishing the arena on Vet. The normal version, the non-perfect version, drops from just the normal version of the arena. The difference between the perfect and the normal version is that additional Magicka regen. So the non-perfect version does not have that Magicka regen, but the other effect remains the same. Steadfast Ward applies major vitality to your target for 3 seconds, increasing their healing taken on your target by 30%. So pretty nice overall in certain scenarios, particularly things like Cloud Rest to combat Baneful Mark, and on the Kestis to deal with the Ice Prison healing debuff. So situationally useful, but definitely a set that I would recommend picking up. Steadfast Ward is actually not that bad of an ability for on certain classes. On Templars it's definitely not as strong, but definitely a set that you will want to pick up if you intend on progressing Cloud Rest or Sunspire. Beyond the Blackrose Prison staff, we're going to move on now to the Maelstrom Restoration staff, which is not so great for PvE. So whenever you critically heal with regeneration, you restore 800 Magicka. This effect can occur once every 4 seconds. So this basically ends up being 200 Magicka a second if you're able to proc it on cooldown. Again, sustain on a healer in Scalebreaker is actually fairly easy due to the changes that were made to energy orbs. So Maelstrom Restoration staff, not particularly useful overall. You can still hold on to it. There might be some instances where it might be useful, but generally speaking, it's not going to be as strong as the final restoration staff, arena restoration staff, the Master's Restoration staff. Master Restoration staff has been buffed, so the initial heal of Grand Healing restores 740 stamina to you and allies affected. Previously, it was 258, so it got about a 200% buff to the amount of stamina that it returns. So this basically means you can give back a lot of stamina if you spam Healing Springs or Illustrious Healing. So this is definitely a great staff to go for now that they've buffed the amount of stamina that it returns, especially in this stam DPS heavy meta. So this comes from Dragonstar Arena. You have to complete it on Vet, you cannot complete it on normal. So that's the only limitation of doing the Master's Restoration staff. You're going to have to trudge through Dragonstar Arena. Moving on from there, there are a couple of other sets here that you might want to consider picking up. So we're just going to go down the list here. There's nothing really in the Cyrodiil sets. In terms of dungeon sets, there are a handful of dungeon sets that you might want to pick up. The first one that I would pick up would be Sanctuary. This is going to be situationally useful because the healing received buff that you get from the 5-piece is very limited in range. It's only within 10 meters. Plus, in ESO, it's actually very easy to overheal. Now, when we say overhealing, that basically means if somebody is down 5,000 health and you heal for 8,000, you get the 5,000 health back, but you basically wasted 3,000 healing. So you want to kind of bring down your overall healing strength to match that 5,000. It's actually fairly easy to overheal at ESO, so the additional healing received is not that strong of a buff as it would make it appear. Now, in some fights, it's going to be very useful. Cloud Rest, for example, to help combat Baneful Mark, Kestis to help combat the Ice Prison debuff. You kind of get the gist here. If there is some sort of Defile debuff, Sanctuary does have a place, but those fights are fairly uncommon in endgame PvE, and so Sanctuary is kind of relegated more to a niche set, more of a fight-specific set. Moving on from there, we have Worm, which is not particularly useful in stam-heavy groups, but in groups with Magicka DPS, so Worm is actually pretty strong. It reduces the cost of Magicka abilities by 4% for everybody within 28 meters of you. So really nice for overall sustain if you have Magicka DPS in group. If you're running on a stamina-only group, Worm obviously loses its appeal because they don't really use Magicka abilities as stamina DPS. But beyond that, the only other sets here would probably be Jorvuld's Guidance for the additional duration on major buffs and minor buffs. Not particularly great on Templars, more useful on some other classes that give out a little bit more buffs. But the main reason you would be using Jorvuld's Guidance would be for the Warhorn buff in order to buff up your major force uptime. You get an additional approximately 4 seconds on major force if you use Jorvuld's Guidance. So that's the primary reason why you would use Jorvuld's Guidance. And then from there, there is some argument to be made for Hollowfang's Thirst, but that being said, it's not really all that great because it is both on critical heals or critical damage. So if you critically damage something, for example with your Blockade of Storms, then Hollowfang's Thirst is going to proc on the enemy. Now in Stack and Burn fights, this is not necessarily a bad idea, but it doesn't restore stamina, it restores Magicka in a stamina heavy kind of DPS meta. It's not going to be particularly useful. In addition, magic DPS tend to not be within melee range except for those stack and burn fights, so overall not that great, but it is something that you could potentially pick up. I just wouldn't necessarily consider it a set that you should have as a healer. For overland sets, not that many overland sets to pick up. In fact, I can't really think of any that I would pick up as a healer. For trial sets as a Templar, the other one that I would probably say you should pick up is going to be Healing Mage. This is more for progression style groups, where you use an area of effect heal ability to reduce the weapon damage of all enemies within 10 meters of you by 430 for 3 seconds. So pretty decent for progression groups because it lowers the damage coming in, but it doesn't help against environmental effects, and you are giving up a little bit of DPS utility to kind of get this set. That being said, the survivability that it does provide is fairly useful. It is fairly limited in terms of the 10 meter range and also lasts for 3 seconds. The good thing is most of your healing abilities, if not all of them, do proc Healing Mage, the Mending set, so it's not that difficult to maintain. One set that you might want to consider picking up is going to be Nahviintaas from the Sunspire trial. This one is interesting and has been made potentially useful due to the changes to energy orb. So when an ally activates one of your synergies, you and the ally who activated the synergy get 12% cost reduction for non-ultimate abilities for 3 seconds. This effect can occur every 6 seconds per target. So in terms of the changes done to energy orbs, basically you can only have one orb out at a time, but it won't disappear if somebody uses the synergy. This makes it potentially good because now you're able to give out this 5-piece effect to everybody that uses the orb on a single orb, so you don't have to necessarily spam orbs to give it out to multiple people. However, the cost reduction uptime combined with the synergy cooldown doesn't make it quite as strong as Worm or Hircine's. Though not particularly great, but it still remains to be seen whether or not this is going to be a decent set or not, because that kind of burst cost reduction could be potentially useful for overall sustain. Now, I did mention Hircine's. Hircine's is a medium armor set from Selene's Web. So yes, there are a handful of medium armor sets that you're going to want to potentially pick up. So Hircine's reduces the cost of stamina abilities by 4%. Now, as a medium armor set, you will want to have this on the jewelry as well as your weapons. You could potentially wear one armor set with this, but most healers might not necessarily want to go this route or not. It really depends on what sort of monster helm you're running. I personally like going 5 light, 1 medium, 1 heavy on my healers. Other healers like going with 6 light, 1 heavy. Still others prefer 7 light, so it's kind of up to you how you want to play around with that. The most common combination I've seen though is the jewelry and weapons with Hircine's Veneer. So this is kind of basically a stamina version of Worm. If you have a lot of Magicka DPS, isn't very useful, but if you're in a stamina heavy group, then Hircine's is obviously very strong to use here. But beyond that, that is one medium armor set that you want to potentially pick up, and I think that is it in terms of medium armor sets. So a lot of the sets are down in the description below, so just check those sets out. And then some of these sets we will want to pick up for jewelry, weapons. Other sets you're going to wear on the body. Generally speaking, any set that procs and carry over will pretty much be safe to use in combination with one of those arena restoration staffs that I mentioned earlier. So for example, Infallible Aether is one set that you could wear on the 1 bar set. Olorime is a set that you can wear on 1 bar because those are proc sets. Other sets like Worm, Hircine, Sanctuary, where the 5-piece is a static bonus, you're going to want to have those on your body instead. So that's kind of where you want to kind of separate things out. Of course, you don't have to use an arena restoration staff. So for example, in this build we have martial knowledge on both of our bars here. So that way you don't really need to worry about, which set do I run on what bar and so on. But generally speaking, that's kind of up to you how you want to deal with that. Now that I mentioned Infallible Aether, I should probably bring up Infallible Aether here. So this is a pretty nice set overall. It's probably the most consistent way to get minor vulnerability. So this applies minor vulnerability on your fully charged heavy attacks. And yes, it is now fully charged heavy attacks, so you do need to fully channel your resto staff or your lightning staff to get that additional minor vulnerability. But it is the most consistent way to get minor vulnerability, so definitely a set you should pick up as a healer. In terms of traits and enchants for all of your armor, jewelry, and weapons, so there are a couple of different kind of armor traits that you can pick up. I like to have Infused on my large pieces. Other people like to have all divines. It's kind of up to you how you want to deal with that. The only thing that I would recommend is definitely getting the Prismatic enchants on your large pieces, regardless of whether you're running Infused or not. You would like to have that additional health, additional stamina. That is fairly useful overall. For our small pieces though, we are growing the vines with max Magicka enchants. We do want to maximize our magic so that way we get more heal strength out. For jewelry, all arcane, and depending on the set, you can run either spell damage or Magicka regen glyphs. So for example, with martial knowledge, we have a lot of spell damage glyphs because we don't really need a lot of Magicka regen because we have Magicka regen for Olorime. So Olorime and martial knowledge are pretty balanced out because you get pretty decent Magicka regen and spell damage. The general rule of thumb that I shoot for is about 2,000 of each unbuffed, so 2,000 Magicka regen and 2,000 spell damage. Now, your Mundus choice will have a little bit of an effect here, because if you go with the Ritual, you don't need to invest as much into spell damage. If you run the Archonach, you don't need to invest as much into Magicka regen. So generally speaking, try to shoot for 2,000 and err on the side of a little bit higher spell damage than Magicka regen if you go that route. For weapons, your Resto Staff, you have a few options. You can go with Powered for stronger heals, you can go with Infused for stronger enchants, go Defensive if you want some more resistances, but generally speaking, the two most popular traits that I've seen are Powered and Infused, with Decisive for the better ultimate generation as a close third. In terms of enchants, few options as well. I have a weapon damage enchant here to improve my overall spell damage. You can also go with weakening to reduce the damage that's incoming to the group. You might be asked to run Crusher depending on what your enchants your tanks might be running. You might want to go with something like an Absorb Magicka if you need the additional Magicka regen. So it's kind of up to you how you want to deal with that enchants. Backbar, same thing here. Whatever enchant you feel is necessary or correct for your group. For your backbar trait though, Infused is typically speaking going to be the trait of choice here for the stronger enchants. And you are still going with the Lightning Staff on the backbar and a Restoration Staff on the front bar. So that is all of our gear stuff. Again, all that stuff is in the description below, all the various sets that you might want to pick up as a healer. Moving on to our character sheet, we are a Breton. Bretons are obviously one of the strongest races when it comes to healers. The other one probably being Ultimate or Dark Elves. So either the High Elves or the Dark Elves. So Bretons get 2,000 max Magicka, and they get 7% cost reduction to all Magicka abilities and 100 additional Magicka regen. So sustain should be no issue as a Breton. High Elves and Dark Elves both get 258 additional spell damage, and they also get some max Magicka. High Elves get 2,000, Dark Elves get 1875. So they come in packing a lot of spell damage bonuses compared to sustain bonuses. That's kind of the trade-off that you're making if you decide to go with the Elves versus the Breton. You can also go with Khajiits if you'd like. Khajiits aren't necessarily the first choice, but they're also not a poor choice either. They get 875 across all three resources. They get 85 Magicka regen and stamina regen, 100 health regen, and they get 10% additional critical healing done and critical damage done. So they're very good as sort of a jack of all trades, but they will not necessarily be as good as a Breton or a High Elf or a Dark Elf in terms of raw healing potential. That being said, Khajiits are a fairly decent option if you kind of want to dip your toes into all three roles in the game. For attributes, all points are going into max Magicka here. You can shift a few points into health if you'd like to give yourself some more survivability. The amount of health that I have here is what you see with 3 infused prismatic enchants and Clockwork Citrus Fillet. So we're sitting at pretty good health here, 17.6k before toughness and before Ebon. So with toughness and Ebon, we'd be sitting pretty close to 20k, probably around 19.5k max health. But not necessarily necessary to shift some points into health here, although you certainly can do so if you feel like you need a survivability. For Mundus, you have two options. You have the Atronach for Magicka regen, or you have the Ritual for additional healing strength. You could also go with the Apprentice, which gives you spell damage if you want to also do a little bit of DPS on the side as a healer. That's kind of up to you, but those are your 3 primary Mundus options. For food, Clockwork Citrus Fillet for the health, Magicka, and the Magicka regen. You can also go with Witchmother's Potent Brew if you'd like. The other food you could potentially use is going to be something called Orzagar's Red Frothgar. This gives you 5,000 max health and I think 458 Magicka regen, but you don't get any additional max Magicka. So you're giving up some of your max resource pool for some more survivability with more health and higher regen compared to Clockwork Citrus Fillet. Kind of up to you how you want to deal with that. And then, we're not a vampire here, but you can certainly be a vampire if you would like. You get 10% additional Magicka regen and stamina regen when you're at stage 2, but you do take 15% more fire damage as a stage 2 vampire as well. So you kind of have to decide whether that trade-off is worthy of your particular situation. Now for skills, starting off with our Resto Staff bar, we have Illustrious Healing, Combat Prayer, Energy Orbs, Power of the Light, Breath of Life, and Solar Prison. And on our back bar we have Luminous Shards, Elemental Drain, Blockade of Storms, Channel Focus, Extended Ritual, and Aggressive Warhorn. There are a few abilities I do want to point out here as potentially good kind of options that you might want to include in your repertoire in case you do need to use them here. So, the first one would be Ritual of Rebirth. This would kind of be a replacement for Breath of Life here. This is basically an AoE version of Breath of Life. You can see here that we heal for 11,498 across an area versus 11,498 for a single target. So basically the trade-off you're making here is you basically heal everybody around you for more Magicka. So it's kind of up to you which one of these two abilities you want to go for. The Templar Healing Ultimate, Remembrance or Practice Incantation, you're probably not going to use very often, but it is an option to hold on to. I personally have never seen it really been used too much in a raid, but in terms of raw healing potential, this is a fairly good ultimate because it also is fairly cheap to use as well. In terms of the Restoration Staff line here, Rapid Regeneration is probably going to be the best option here as opposed to Radiating Regeneration. Steadfast Ward, either of the wars are pretty decent, with Healing Ward being more useful for PvE compared to Ward Ally. You're going to want to pick this ability up regardless, because if you do end up going through Cloud Rest or Sunspire, this is definitely an ability you need to use in conjunction with the Blackrose Prison staff. So I'd probably pick up Healing Ward if you can. Now in terms of Force Siphon, you can go with Siphon Spirit or Quick Siphon. Quick Siphon does give the Minor Expedition to anybody who's healed by the Minor Lifesteal that's applied. Siphon Spirit applies Minor Lifesteal and Minor Magicka Steal. That being said, you're already getting Minor Magicka Steal from Elemental Drain, and Blood Altar is a better source of Minor Lifesteal than Siphon Spirit because it comes with an additional synergy. So I personally wouldn't use either Morph of Force Siphon here. In terms of the Restoration Staff Ultimate, it's actually not bad if you decide to go with Light's Champion. Pretty decent in form and content, and very similar to the Templar Healing Ultimate. It's a fairly cheap ultimate and does give pretty nice burst heal for the ultimate that you need to spend for it. So it is something you might want to have on hand, but it's not going to be an ultimate you're going to be using very often. If you ever need a shield, you can go with either Morph of the Annulment, Dampen Magicka, or Harness Magicka. Under the Undaunted line, make sure to have all these abilities unlocked. So we already have Energy Orb out for the healing, but you definitely want to have Overflowing Altar for the Blood Feast synergy as well as the Minor Lifesteal. Shadow Silk is still a fairly decent synergy. It's not really as strong as it used to be 2 or 3 patches ago, but it is still a pretty strong synergy, so you still want to have that open. Inner Rage is kind of up to you if you want it. There are some strategies that require the healer to taunt things, so it's kind of up to you if you want to get this or not, if you are using those strategies. And Bone Surge for the Spinal Surge synergy for additional Alkosh uptime, and also the Major Vitality bonus here in those situations where you need the major Vitality. So, for example, classic example, Cloud Rest in order to combat Baneful Mark. Beyond that, Mend Wounds is a pretty decent ability on the Siege Borderline if you have access to it. I personally prefer the Mend Spirits, so that way you give them Major Ward, Major Resolve if they don't already have it. But Symbiosis is also pretty decent if you need to self-heal as well. So for example, in the Castiz hard mode, Symbiosis might be better than Mend Spirit because it also heals you and you are also taking damage in the Castiz hard mode. It's definitely an ability that I would recommend picking up. Under the Fighter's Guild line, pick up either Morph of Circle of Protection. I'd probably go with Ring of Preservation because it also has a bit of a heal. Not very strong because it does scale off of your stamina abilities, so max stamina and weapon damage, but still useful nonetheless, and you still provide additional minor protection. Now it doesn't last very long, it only lasts for 8 seconds, but it is useful for the heal as well as the minor protection. So definitely pick up Ring of Preservation if you can. Moving on from there, under the support line, definitely pick up Efficient Purge for the additional cleanse. Obviously the Purify Synergy from Extended Ritual has a 20-second cooldown, so it's not consistent, compared to Efficient Purge, which is basically a purge on cooldown. Then you can also pick up Reviving Barrier or Replenishing Barrier for the very large shield that you give out. It now affects up to 12 people, so really strong ultimate if you need the additional survivability there. And the last one would be Guard. There are some strategies which require the healers to guard the tank, so you will want to pick up Guard here. Generally speaking, doesn't really matter which morph you go for. Mystic Guard might be more beneficial because of the Minor Vitality, but most tanking specs will have some source of Minor Vitality, so it doesn't really matter which morph you decide to go for. Moving on from there, we have all of our champion points. So the CP cap is still 810. They haven't changed that at all. So you have 270 points to put across each of our different constellation types. Starting with our green CPs, 100 Arcanist, 75 Tenacity. That leaves the remaining 95 points, which I put 31 Shadow Ward, 31 Tumbling, and 33 Warlord. Kind of up to you how you want to distribute these. I would definitely put at the very least 100 into Arcanist and Tenacity. You can drop this down however you'd like, depending on how well you're able to sustain. For blue CPs, the only things that really matter is going to be 100 Blessed and 100 Elfborn. There are a few healing abilities that do scale off of stamina, but you generally will not be using them. So as long as you get 100 Elfborn and 100 Blessed, the other CPs don't really matter because this is more DPS oriented trees than actual healing oriented. So for example, I have 49 Ellie Expert, 13 Spell Erosion, and 8 into Staff Expert. But really you can place them wherever you'd like. Finally, our red CPs, this is kind of a more balanced approach here. So we have 81 Ironclad, 61 Thick-Skinned, and 64 in both Hardy and Elemental Defender. So that is all of the build stuff. So now let's go ahead and talk about how healing has changed between Elsewhere and Scalebreaker and how that has changed our philosophy and our gameplay. So as of Scalebreaker, you cannot stack springs anymore. So previously you'd be able to put down multiple springs, but you can see here as I'm placing multiple springs down, the previous one is disappearing. The trade-off is that these last longer. So Illustrious Healing will now last for 12 seconds at rank 4, and Healing Springs, let's double check the duration, will last for 8 seconds at rank 4. So kind of a trade-off there. You can no longer just place a bunch of Healing Springs down. They will just disappear now. So that's the one major change. Mostly going to be affecting in situations where you need high healing output. So for example, Lachesis Hard Mode, Cloud Rest Execute. This change definitely changes how you're going to be using these abilities as sort of out-heal a situation where you need to basically do a heal check. The other big change is that you can only have one orb out at a time. So in Elsewhere, you're able to pump out orbs however many you'd like. But now you can see here, as I try to pump out more orbs, the last one disappears. Now, the trade-off to this is, if anybody can activate the synergy and it will not consume the orb. So on live, the orb, when somebody activates the synergy, is popped and destroyed, and it doesn't heal anybody anymore. On Scalebreaker, this orb will basically last the whole 10 seconds. It also travels a little bit slower now, and anybody can activate the synergy without consuming the orb. So, what that basically means is you no longer have to pump out orbs one after another. You still want to make sure you have an orb out at all times, so basically you're going to want to cast it at the very least every 10 seconds, probably a little bit sooner than that depending on how far apart your party is. You can already see the range of orbs is actually pretty decently far, and the healing ticks themselves, as you can see here, stops healing at around maybe about halfway through. So you might want to be casting it every 5 seconds instead, or maybe perhaps you just want to do it every 10 seconds, depends on the distance of the group from you. But now, that basically lets us use our global cooldowns instead of orb spamming to kind of focus in on maintaining buffs and debuffs. So things like minor vulnerability from Infallible Aether, Power of the Light, Combat Prayer. All those buffs now we can kind of focus in on using our global cooldowns to maintain those buffs. Another thing we can do now is also focus in a little bit more on DPS perhaps. So this is more for very high-end PvE groups, but sometimes the healers will also be doing some DPS as well. The fact that you only need to pump out one orb now basically means you can just use the rest of your global cooldowns to improve DPS, kill things faster. You don't have to do as much healing because the fights last shorter. That's kind of the trade-off that we're making here with these two changes. So now, right now, the best thing to do to kind of get out of any sort of healing checks is to basically spam your burst AoE heal. So that would be something like just basically laying down a spring, pumping on an orb, and then just combat prayering the whole time, or using your AoE heal. That's really what it boils down to. In terms of the actual healing meta now, it's pretty much focusing more on raw healing output now compared to sustain, because again, you only have to put out one orb now every 10 or so seconds. Theoretically, you can pump one out every 20 seconds, you'd be fine, but orbs is still actually a pretty strong heal, so you still want to make sure to have at least one orb out, the one orb out at all times. So you don't need to really focus in anymore on sustain so much because you're not really pumping out that many orbs anymore. So you're able to use those to basically spam something like Comet Prayer in order to burst heal everybody back up to full. You can also use something like, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this, but you could spam, for example, Breath of Life or Ritual Rebirth as a burst heal as well, to kind of get everybody back up. But beyond that, the kind of important things to maintain on the back bar would be something like all three of these, basically all four of these abilities. So Elemental Drain if you are responsible for maintaining Elemental Drain, Blockade for your enchant effects, Channel and Focus for the additional Magicka regen if you need it, you don't necessarily need it, and then Extended Ritual for the heal over time, as well as the Synergy Purify, so pretty nice synergy there. Shards is really useful if you want to get on the tank right away. It's the one advantage that you have over Wardens. So for example, if you're standing, let's say over there is the boss and your tank, the orbs are going to take quite a while to get there. You will not be consumed, but it's going to take quite a while to get over there, versus Shards, which is pretty much immediate. So use Shards as an immediate source of resource return, and use Orbs as sort of a both heal as well as a resource return for your DPS, who might not necessarily need the stamina right away compared to like a tank, for example. I don't really main a healer, so that's pretty much the best advice that I'm able to give. I will have some links in the description below to some people who main heals, so you can watch their gameplay and ask them questions about how you go around playing a Templar healer to get the best and most up-to-date advice. So that is it for this video. Hope you guys found this informative. Again, if you guys have any questions about the build, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I will try to answer them to the best of my ability. And there are links, again, in the description below to YouTube channels and Twitch streams of people who main healers, so you can ask them your questions instead if you want a more precise and authoritative answer there. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.